Hi everyone, welcome to our introduction to the chemical structure of the macronutrients. Okay, what I have here is an example trying to illustrate how important chemistry is to the field of nutrition. So on the top of the slide, we have maltose, which is a disaccharide that we can digest because it has an alpha-1,4 glycosidic linkage. Cellubiose on the bottom is actually a fiber and has a beta-1,4 glycosidic linkage that we cannot break down. So this one difference, this one change in linkage, is what causes us to be able to either digest or not digest a particular disaccharide, showing how important chemistry is to the field of nutrition. Nutrients, guys, on that note, are substances or chemicals that provide nourishment that's essential for the growth and maintenance of life. Macro, of course, means big, large, great, etc. So therefore, macronutrients are nutrients we need in large amounts. There are three certainly macronutrients and arguably four. They're carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and alcohol. Of course, it's the essential aspect of this that makes alcohol questionable, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. All the macronutrients are actually made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Protein also contains the elements nitrogen and sulfur. In bold here, I've listed the number of bonds these elements can make. This is important because, like I just said, the macronutrients are made out of these elements. By knowing how many bonds they can make, we can understand their structures more easily. So carbon makes 4 bonds, hydrogen 1, oxygen 2. And if it's negative, it loses a bond, and that's a nice way to remember it. So if it's negative, oxygen loses a bond, so it has 1 bond. And nitrogen, if it becomes positive, will gain a bond and can have 4 or 3 bonds. Oxygen basically in the body is always negative, and nitrogen's usually always positive. There's exceptions to that, but generally speaking, that's what happens. We're going to start our macronutrient discussion actually with alcohol. And we're going to start with alcohol because it's the simplest macronutrient. It's actually only 9 atoms. So it's 2 carbons, an oxygen, and 3 hydrogens. Alcohol is one of the most energy-dense macronutrients, providing 7 calories per gram. However, it's obviously not essential. We don't need to drink alcohol to survive, which is why some people argue that it's not a macronutrient. However, we also don't technically need carbohydrates to survive, at least at adulthood. So there's some argument whether that's true or not, and some people do get a lot of their calories from alcohol. So leaving it out of the macronutrient discussion may not be helpful either, even if it's not truly a macronutrient. Alcohol is not a polymer. Again, it's the smallest or the simplest macronutrient. And then ethanol, which is what alcohol's more scientifically named, is actually converted to another compound called acetaldehyde in the liver. And that, in turn, provides energy. All right, now we're going to start talking about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are made up of simple sugars or monosaccharides. So those are identical terms. A simple sugar is the same as a monosaccharide. Both can either be linear or circular. So in the body, they just kind of spontaneously go through these forms. And guys, it's not necessarily important that you memorize these structures right now, but just understand that they can be linear or circular. Carbohydrates can be. Again, they're either linear or circular, but they all have the same chemical formula. All carbohydrates are C6H12O6. There are actually 3 monosaccharides we hear about a lot: glucose, galactose, and fructose. Together, those 3 monosaccharides can form disaccharides. So glucose and glucose actually makes maltose, which we talked about on our very first slide. Glucose and galactose makes lactose, which people probably know about because of lactose intolerance or an inability to break down glucose and galactose. An inability to break down lactose into glucose and galactose. And then glucose and fructose is actually sucrose or table sugar. Some carbohydrates are actually complex carbohydrates. So we just talked about simple carbohydrates, and then disaccharides are just two instead of one. So complex carbohydrates are hundreds or maybe even thousands of carbohydrates attached. They're all polymers of monosaccharides, and some good examples are starch and fiber in foods, and then glycogen within our own bodies. Carbohydrates provide 4 calories per gram, and like we just discussed about alcohol, carbohydrates are technically non-essential. And that's because they can be produced from proteins in the liver in a process called gluconeogenesis. So in other words, a person can eat protein and make carbohydrates. Carbohydrates also represent the most immediate source of energy in the body. Neurons and red blood cells almost exclusively use carbohydrates, although they also can use something called ketone bodies. Proteins, just like carbohydrates, are actually always polymers. They're made up of little building blocks called amino acids. So amino acids are amino acids because they have an amino group, which is a group that's an NH2 group. So it's a nitrogen and 2 hydrogens. So by definition, all proteins contain nitrogen. Proteins are essential because 9 of the 20 amino acids are essential. Our body does not have the ability to produce them, so we need to obtain them from the diet. And then the shapes of proteins, both in our body and in our foods, vary according to whatever function they perform or perform. There are several broad classes of fats that are quite a bit different. Triglycerides and phospholipids actually look very similar. So on the left, triglyceride. On the bottom, we have a phospholipid. The difference is that in a phospholipid, one of those long fatty acid tails has been replaced with a phosphate group. So if you were identifying those, the difference between a triglyceride and a phospholipid, all you need to look at is the head groups. If there's a phosphate group, you know it's a phospholipid. Cholesterols also look completely unlike all the other fats in the sense that they have this complex ring structure that we really didn't see anywhere else except for maybe in carbohydrates. Okay, and then as I just said, fats can be circular or linear. So cholesterol is, of course, an example of that circular fat. They provide the most energy at 9 calories per gram, and they're not polymers. That concludes our lecture regarding the chemical structure and an introduction to the chemical structure of the macronutrients. We'll be talking about this in more depth across the next several weeks of this unit. Again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them to the question and answer board on Blackboard or send me an email. All right, bye-bye.